Guess what? He did it again. The same internet preacher is back, but this time he is claiming that Allah is not all-knowing. Why? Because according to him, Allah didn't know that marriage of cousins doubles the risk of many genetic diseases. Therefore, he said, if the Quran is really from God, it would have made it haram to marry your first cousin, just, to spare humanity from this huge risk. And then, of course, as usual, he used this opportunity to invite his audience to Christianity. This guy will never give up. Anyway, before I fully refute his claim, I want to admit first that whatever he said is actually scientifically correct. I checked this peer-reviewed workshop report in genetics and medicine, which is published in Nature. And it says that normally the risk of a child being born with a major, defect is typically around 2 or 3%. But however, within cousin marriages, this percentage raises an extra percentage of 1.7 to 2.8% higher. When he rounds the numbers up and down a little bit, it becomes very convenient for him to say that the risk doubles from 2% to 4% for those who choose to marry their cousins. His argument logic is as follows. The author of the Quran didn't know, or at least didn't care enough, to spare us the harm of this extra 2% risk. That's why he didn't declare cousin marriage to be haram. In other words, the Quran should have declared everything that has an extra 2% risk to be haram. Otherwise, he is not going to believe in it. According to the claim of the preacher, 2% risk should be haram. I want to keep this rule somewhere on the screen because we're about to put it to the test. As this new 2% rule that he just created will open a huge can of worms for us. For example, based on the data from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, if we compare the risk of a child being born with Down syndrome from a 45-year-old mother to a 20-year-old mother, the risk jumps from 0.07% all the way up to 3.33%. That's more than 3% extra risk, which is much higher than the 2% he was complaining about. If we look at the chromosomal abnormalities, the added risk is over 4%, which is again much higher than the 2% introduced by cousin marriages. By the preacher's ironclad logic, the Quran should have strictly outlawed marriage after 45. Otherwise, some smart guy will come along now and claim that God isn't really all-knowing because the Quran didn't forbid marriage after 45. You know what? Let's keep going. Did you know that eating fast food just once a week, increases your risk of heart disease mortality by 20%? Eat it 2 or 3 times a week and it spikes by 50%. So based on his logic, we should expect a verse in the Quran saying that cheeseburgers are haram. You know what? Here is a fun fact for you. According to the Journal of American Planning Association, Florida Atlantic University, people who are walking or biking are about 30 times more likely to be killed than those driving a car. And on the other side of the world, the European Transport Safety Council says that walking carries a 7 to 9 times higher fatality risk per distance traveled compared to traveling inside a car. The sources are on the right side if you want to check them out. And this 30 times multiplier is much, much more than the 2% extra risk associated with cousin marriages. So by the preacher's logic, Allah should have revealed the verse declaring walking to be haram. Can you see how ridiculous this rule that he just made up is? If I were a hypocrite, you know what I would do? I would take this exact argument and weaponize it against the Bible. I would say something like, the Bible God is not all-knowing because he didn't know that pregnancy over 45 adds an extra 4% risk of chromosomal abnormality. Therefore, the Bible is not from God. If I were a hypocrite, I would demand that the Bible God explicitly name every action that causes extra 3% risk of Down syndrome to be haram. If I were a hypocrite, I would claim that the Bible God is not all-knowing when he said that drinking water is harmful. Yes, this is what the verse says. It's harmful to drink wine alone. And it's also harmful to drink water alone. It's only healthy if you drink both together. While according to the World Health Organization, no level of alcohol consumption is safe for our health. But you know what? I am not a hypocrite. And I'm not gonna make this argument against the Bible. Because if I do, I would be immediately refuted and humiliated. And by the way, cousin marriages aren't even forbidden in his own book. On the contrary, it was incredibly common among the patriarchs of the Old Testament, and in some cases, it was even encouraged in the Bible to marry your cousins just to keep the property or lineage within a specific tribe. For example, in Genesis 29, your prophet Jacob married Rachel and Leah, first cousins. And before you attack your own prophet, in Genesis 24, Isaac married Rebekah, first cousins. Also in Numbers 36, the daughters were explicitly instructed to marry their cousins just to keep the land in the family. And by the way, even secular law doesn't care. In 19 states and in the District of Columbia, first cousins are allowed to marry without any restrictions. And in 7 other states, first cousins may marry but only if they meet specific conditions, like the state of Arizona or Utah or Wisconsin. And also in the UK, there are no conditional requirements whatsoever for first cousins to get married. And in both countries, there is no legal restrictions regarding getting pregnant after 45 or eating fast food 3 times a week. I don't see the preacher attacking the American law or the English law or attacking his prophet in the Bible who married his cousin. He only uses this argument against the Quran, which is very suspicious to me. It makes me think that he doesn't really care about the birth risks or the health of the children. It makes me think that he's just using this as a bullying tactic against those whom he doesn't like. As you can see, it's not a real moral argument. It's the theological equivalent of a schoolyard bully insecurely flexing his status just to feel superior to other kids. As in saying, "Oh no, you only worship one God, you are stupid. Maybe you're stupid because your parents are cousins. If you were as smart as me, you would have worshipped 3 gods instead. 3 is better than 1. See how smart I am? But you? Nah, you're son of cousins." Got it? Anyway, enough with the preacher. Let's look at the actual Islamic perspective. Contrary to common belief, Islamic jurisprudence, Islamic fiqh, is strongly against cousin marriages. Yes, we heard me correctly. And before I show you the sources, I need to give some context. In Islam, some actions are strictly forbidden, like cheating, stealing, killing, adultery, shirk. You all know them. But some other actions are lightly forbidden, like, for example, delaying your prayer for half an hour or 1 hour past its time, or, for example, skipping brushing your teeth after a meal. That is forbidden, but it's not a sin if you do it. We call it makruh. And there are some actions that are left for human research to determine. The Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him, told us to do our research and to follow the harm principle. La darar wa la dirar. Let there be no harm and no reciprocating harm. For example, back in the 1930s, when medical doctors were actually claiming that cigarettes are good for our health, Muslim scholars declared smoking to be halal, as they thought that there is no harm in them. But later on, when doctors finally started saying that smoking is very, very bad for our health, Muslim scholars reversed the fatwa, declaring smoking to be haram from now on. See how the Sharia ruling is simply based on the harm principle, la darar wa la dirar. Now when we apply the same harm principle to the question of cousin marriage, we don't get a straight up answer like the one we got from smoking. And that is for 3 reasons. Reason number 1 is the 2% risk doesn't reach the catastrophic threshold of something like smoking. Reason number 2 is that the risk is actually entirely avoidable. You simply go to the nearest hospital, get a premarital screening, and the professionals there will tell you if the risk even applies to your specific genetics or not. Easy. Reason number 3 is that there are other things to put into consideration when it comes to marriage. Birth risks is not the only factor there. To fully understand it, Don't assume that everyone in the whole world is living in a city filled with diverse people and immigrants from all over the world who are meeting each other on Tinder every day. No, that's just your bubble that you live in. In reality, there are many, many remote villages around the world in which the population is mostly from the same tribe. You walk the streets in one of them, and 90% of the people you meet are either your close or far cousins. What are you gonna do? Go extinct? And even if we go back to your large city, there are still more important factors to be considered. I remember a couple of years ago when one of the immigrants were complaining about a very difficult situation he was in. After his immigration, he discovered that this new society had completely opposite values to his. They normalize every major sin in the book, and they call them freedom. He said, I'm worried if I marry someone who doesn't share my faith, she will raise my children to be like this. I'm worried my kids will lose their Islamic identity completely. And the only woman I can find that I can trust to be the future mother of my children is my cousin who I immigrated with. So, should I marry my cousin and have this extra 2% birth risk? Or should I marry this other woman and risk having lost children who will fall into many, many major sins, calling them normal, calling them freedom, who will end up very far away from Jannah? This is why the rulings in Islam are not all halal and haram. Some rulings are very strict and some rulings are more of a recommendation. We say it's recommended to avoid cousin marriage unless it is necessary. It's a guideline, much like when the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him, strongly recommended brushing our teeth after each prayer. But he also said that if you fail to do it a couple of times, they won't count as sins. And what you just discovered about genetics is not new to us Muslims. Back in the 8th century, specifically in this book, Imam al-Shafi'i warned us that families who only marry internally will produce weaker offspring. This was our Muslim Imam in the 8th century, long before the West even discovered medicine. Also, by the way, in the 7th century, our Muslim Caliphate Umar ibn al-Khattab said, stop marrying within the same family, marry outside the family instead. Islam gave us this nuance and recommendation from the very beginning. And look, if some Muslim societies today choose not to follow the guidance of Islam, that's on them. That's not the fault of the religion. Don't let this distinction confuse you. And remember that the majority of the Islamic teachings are not just a binary halal or haram, black and white. No, actually the majority of God's guidance to us came in the forms of recommended and hated. And that is absolute mercy. As in, do this because it's good for you, don't do that because it's bad for you. It doesn't have to be very strict halal and haram, except if it's like killing or stealing or whatever. So just because an action isn't explicitly classified as a sin or a major sin, that doesn't mean it's encouraged. It's actually heavily discouraged. But God, in His mercy, didn't make it a punishable sin because He knows that some of us will have to do it out of necessity. Islam doesn't promote cousin marriages. It is actually the exact opposite. And if you want to know the real reason why I never really considered Christianity, check out this video. And if you want to support our da'wah, drop a like and share this video with someone who needs it. جزاكم الله خيرا. Salam alaikum.